Well, just following that, I want to add how much this induction to the South Carolina Academy of Authors meant to Jim. He was thrilled. Just knowing that this was going to happen brought him tremendous joy. He was so proud and honored and spoke about it often. And hats off to the South Carolina Academy of Authors. It's a very wise decision. Can you hear me okay? I'm getting a lot of feedback. Okay. I've been asked to speak about the man, and I'm humbled by this opportunity. So many of you knew him better. Harriet, obviously, Will, Wilson, Maria, all the family. But I can articulate easily my sense of this brilliant, funny, tender human being. There are things we all aspire to: peace of mind, finding true love, work that brings us joy, let alone financial reward, spiritual peace. Jim Rigney was one of the few people I've ever known who really lived that dream. He was aware of the many blessings, another of his remarkable talents, and he lived them daily, rather than focusing on the hardships he had to overcome to get where he wanted to be. For example, decorated numerous times for his service in Vietnam, he didn't talk about how that happened, how he received these honors. Instead, he told stories about cheating on his eye exam so he would be eligible to join the Army. We first met Jim and Harriet soon after we moved from New York, which was a month before Hurricane Hugo. We lived next door to their niece, Louisa Moore, and they invited us to a Christmas party. I think it was the year after Hugo. And we met all these creative people, and I felt very hopeful about living in Charleston. It felt a lot like New York used to feel, and we barely knew them, but they reached out to us and invited us to this party. And some of the people we met there in this room, and it's the first time we ever heard about the Poetry Society, and John Bennett was there. And there were many such gatherings that followed, and no one was a better storyteller at these parties than Jim Rigney. He'd stand there and put his hand on that dining room table and just start telling stories. They were always funny, they were always fascinating. I was spellbound. I'd never really met anyone quite like him. And he used to, smoke that pipe, remember? And he had a cape, and he was quite a formidable man. Remember that cape? I'm not making this up. His inclusion in the community of Low Country writers brought considerable legitimacy to the city's current literary renaissance. Although he was often quite private, Jim embraced and supported writers, especially this writer. I used to tease him and say that he was more excited about my appointment as poet laureate than I was. And this isn't true, but the sense of it is true. At readings and celebrations, Jim was always there doing that cheer that Harriet, you've really got it, Harriet. Yeah, there you go. And Jim and Harriet helped throw a party for me when I was named Poet Laureate, and in all the pictures, they're sitting right beside me when that laurel wreath was put on my head. And it's this sort of sense of celebration and capacity to amplify joy that I want to talk about a little bit. And I'm going to tell these stories. They're very personal, but that's okay. They embody the essence of what I want to talk about. I'm going to tell you the story of the turtle release party. And a couple of people here were actually in attendance. Our youngest son, Taylor, had those little turtles that you get them, they're about the size of a teaspoon, and then they're suddenly like the size of a dog, and they're in the tank. And Harriet and Jim were at our house, and we were like, what are we going to do with these turtles? And they said, well, they can come live at our house. They can come into our pond in the back. And so, great, problem solved. Taylor could come visit his turtles, everybody could live happily ever after. Well, what happened was they insisted on having a ceremony in which invited guests were there, hors d'oeuvres were served, a poem was read, wine was poured, and with a flourish, the turtles were released into the pond. Jim, of course, was the master of ceremonies. And young Taylor, who was rather attached to these turtles, was having such a good time, he was fine with this decision. So, that's just an example of how Jim and Harriet lived their lives, which is just extraordinary. You can tell a lot about a person the way they